Okay, we are delighted to have Zach Goodsell presenting for us today. Zach is going to start as Goodsell Fellow at NYU in August this year, and then next year in August he's going to take up an assistant professorship at National University of Singapore. And today he is going to be talking about reasonable rejection and contractualism.
Yeah, thanks, Garth. And thanks everyone for having me. Really happy to be able to give this presentation. So at the start of the handout, we've got this, like, Scanlon's sort of official statement of his flagship, Thomas Scanlon, his official statement of his flagship view, which is contractualism. And I'm sure you can read, but I'm just going to read it out to remind me as well. An act is wrong if and only if any principle that permitted it would be one that could reasonably be rejected by people with the motivation just described, and by that he means people who are, quote, moved to find principles for the general regulation of behavior. And then we've got this parenthetical where it states that same thing in a supposedly equivalent way, where an act is wrong if and only if it would be disallowed by any principle that such people could not reasonably reject. So I don't find this view at all plausible, but I do find it very intriguing about, like, the logical structure of it. In fact, when I first read it, I couldn't really make head nor tail of it, and I thought I'd go sit down to figure out what this view is saying. Now, there's a couple of interesting moving parts in Scanlon's statement. There's these 4 questions that I've listed here. What's a principle? What is it for a principle to permit or disallow something? What is it to reject a principle? And that's going to be sort of the important topic for today. And what makes the rejection of a principle reasonable or unreasonable? And so I was trying to sort of figure out what contractualism is really saying, and hopefully I'd be able to narrow in on what you'd have to interpret these special terms as in order to make the view sort of most plausible. So, and what I found is sort of when I took this view and I tried to read Scanlon, and I couldn't, he talks in a way that's very alien to me. So I was trying to sort of reconstruct what he wants in sort of the way I can understand. And when I was trying to do that, I found some apparent problems arising for the view, that roughly arising from the third question, when there's a couple of different ways to precisify what it is to reject a principle, and I found that on all of those ways you get, or both of those ways rather, you get some apparently pretty big problems. Okay, so let's just start off by talking about the sort of logical structure of what this quote from Scanlon is saying. And so I've got these 4 examples: positive universal, positive existential, and then there's negative universal and existential versions of contractualism, where basically you can see in the quote, he says things like, if any principle that permitted it would be one such that yada, yada, yada. Well, any can be interpreted as all or some. And I was just not sure exactly what would be the best way of trying to interpret these quantifiers. So I've sort of given, that's the sort of the positive, the universal versus existential dimension of variation. And then there's the positive versus negative dimension of variation. That's like the difference between the thing that he says to begin with and then the parenthetical thing that he says is supposedly equivalent. I couldn't see why they were supposed to be equivalent. So I'll make a few observations about these different versions of contractualism, and then we'll decide on one of them, and then we'll sort of investigate that one further. And the observations are on the next page in the handout. The first one is that positive and negative universal contractualism, I'm pretty sure, should be equivalent, because the conditional in here is just the contrapositive of the conditional in 1 and the conditional in 3. So since they differ in that way, they should be logically equivalent. I'm assuming that to forbid is to not permit, and to permit is to not forbid. So 1 and 3 are really equivalent. So that sort of makes it sound like Scanlon probably wanted the interpretation to be the positive universal one when he first stated it, because that is in fact equivalent to 3. By contrast, I'm pretty sure 2 and 4 are not equivalent, because when you negate like P and Q is not equivalent to not P and not Q. So on the face of it, 2 and 4 are not equivalent. And moreover, 1 and 4 are also not equivalent. So, because 1 is universally quantified and 4 is existentially quantified. So we actually have sort of, and moreover, 1 and 2 are not equivalent. So we actually have 3 different and inequivalent versions of contractualism. Namely, 1 and 3 which are equivalent, and then the other 2 which are not equivalent to either. And the question is sort of, which of these is the most plausible? I'm thinking that the first and second version of contractualism, and thereby the third one as well, seem to have like pretty severe problems. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding the terminology, but I'll just give you the apparent counterexamples I gave in observation 3. So let's consider positive universal contractualism, which says that an act is wrong if and only if, for every principle, if it permits that action, then that's a reasonably rejectable principle. So the counterexample to that was the principle, don't kill your friends. And by that I mean it's a principle that forbids all and only actions which consist in killing your friends. I think that's a pretty good principle. I wouldn't want to say I reject it. And I hope that you guys don't reject it either. So let's plug that into positive universal contractualism. Well, that principle, since it forbids all and only actions that consist in killing your friends, it permits killing strangers. Right? It permits me to just walk out onto the street and kill the next person that goes by, supposing it's not my friend. Now, and on the other hand, that principle is not reasonably rejectable, because it seems like it's a good principle, you would have thought. So that would be a counterexample to positive universal contractualism. And that just seems, on the face of it, a pretty good reason to reject positive universal contractualism. Now let's take a putative counterexample to the second thing, which is positive existential contractualism, which says that an act is wrong if and only if some principle that permits it is a reasonably rejectable one. And the apparent counterexample I gave to that one was the principle kill strangers, which is the principle that forbids all and only actions that do not consist in killing strangers. That seems like a pretty bad principle, so I want to say you could reasonably reject it. But let's see how this counterexample works. If we go back to this thing, now consider the actions that you might take of being, so that principle is reasonably rejectable, and it permits being nice to your grandma. So there is a principle that's reasonably rejectable and permits being nice to your grandma, and therefore being nice to your grandma is wrong. That seems also like a pretty bad result. So it seems like the first and second and third versions of contractualism aren't very promising. So from now on, we're just going to be talking about the fourth one, which is hopefully the most promising, which is negative existential contractualism, which says an act is wrong if and only if there's some principle that you couldn't reasonably reject, and which does forbid the act in question. It seems to avoid super big counterexamples like that, but now I'm going to sort of dive into this one in a bit more detail, and we'll find some less devastating but still fairly problematic consequences of this view. So now we've got this thing on the table. The question arises as to how we interpret the special terminology. And the first thing I'm just assuming to simplify matters is that you can basically just identify a principle with the set of actions that it's going to forbid. And so there's these different standards by which an action can be forbidden or not, and those are the different principles. Okay, so I'm thinking that that sort of answers the first and second questions. A principle is just any old standard by which you could forbid a principle. And for a principle to forbid an action or to disallow it is for it to just be one of the things that it disallows. Then there's this third question, which I think is sort of the thing I want to bear down on a bit, which is the question of what it takes to reject a principle. And there's sort of two paths we can take. The first path is rejecting a principle consists in having values which are contrary to that principle. The second option is, and I'll say a bit more about that in a second. The second option is rejecting a principle sort of consists in believing something about the principle, probably that it's an incorrect principle, because Scanlon does think that there is such a thing as right and wrong. So a principle can be incorrect insofar as it forbids things that are in fact fine. So there's these two versions of rejection. One is going to be called booletic rejection, which is the sort of it conflicts with your values. And then the other option is this doxastic rejection, which you believe something about the principle. And we're going to sort of clarify these a bit further and sort of see how contractualism fares when we plug in either of these notions of rejection. So we're going to have booletic contractualism and doxastic contractualism. And we're going to go through those one at a time. And we're going to start with booletic contractualism. So we've already said what a principle is. It's basically just any old property of actions. And the significance of that property of actions is just that, is a principle, and an action A has that property, just means P forbids A. Right, so P might be the property of being a cool action, in which case we just write A as cool as a shorthand for the principle which forbids cool actions forbids A, right? So we're just using sort of the property of the things that it forbids that as a surrogate for the principle. And I'm thinking that we can also think of the values of an agent, suitably idealized, in a sort of very similar way. There's all the different possible actions you could do, and then there's the ones that are like contrary to Steve's values. So we may as well just identify a possible set of values with just a set of possible actions, right? It's the things that those values say no to, right? So your values are also just a principle. They're just another principle. And then there's this, we've got the other moving part is that you can be reasonable or unreasonable. I'm thinking that being reasonable or unreasonable consists in having reasonable or unreasonable values. The thought being that if we're thinking that to reject something consists in having values contrary to that thing, then whether the rejection is reasonable has to come down to whether the values were reasonable. Okay, and the final piece that we need to build in is the question of what is it for some values to be contrary to a principle? And here's the thing that I always forget how I do it. So a principle is rejected by an agent if there's some possible action that's forbidden by P. So there's some action such that the principal forbids it, and the values don't forbid it. Right. This is the claim that V conflicts with P. Does the value conflict with the principal, or the principles conflict with the value? I think it should be symmetric, but I'm just going to write like this. P conflicts with V.
That's one that.
Yeah.
So it's when I'm reading here in this definition of principal P is rejected by an agent, we say the agent has some values V, that's supposed to be exhaustive, like all of the agent, not like one value which you can find which satisfies this property. You're thinking it's the totality.
I'm thinking there's the agent's values, which is one set.
I just want to check.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, your values aren't like, you don't have one value which is like, I hate dancing or something. Unless that is the one thing that you hate out of all of your things.
Okay.
Okay, so now we can sort of state the version of contractualism you get when you sort of precify the words in that way. And here it is, it's bulletic contractualism. An act is wrong if only if there is some principle P such that P forbids A, and for every reasonable set of values V, every action forbidden by P is also an action that is forbidden by V. Right, and to get this, I basically just took those definitions and plugged them into contractualism. I probably made a mistake somewhere, so that's what I intended to do. Now, here's an interesting thing when you take bulletic contractualism out of this guise and you just assume that actually we've already made this assumption, but it's good to make it explicit again. For every set of actions, for every set of possible actions, there's a principle that forbids all and only those ones. Then bulletic contractualism actually simplifies to this thing that I've called hash, which is the action A is wrong if and only if for every reasonable value system B, or reasonable set of values B, A is contrary to B. I know there's a lot of like tongue twisters or maybe brain twisters or something. I thought about these things for a really long time. I'm pretty sure that this is the sort of thing that is actually, this is how it works, but please tell me if I've made a mistake. So the thing that I wanted to point out here is actually that the notion of principle disappears, just on the assumption that you have a plenitude of different principles that could rule out every different possible set of possible actions. And in one sense, that's kind of good news because I sort of had no idea what a principle was to begin with. In another sense, that's kind of bad news from how accurate this is going to be in interpretation of Scanlon, because it seems like he thinks that the notion of principle is doing some work, and I couldn't really figure out what that is. And it seems like this bulletic contractualism thing isn't helping with figuring out why Scanlon thought that principles were good. Anyway, so that's the first observation. But the second and more important observation is that this sort of view is just not a very plausible one, because what we're essentially doing is to determine what's wrong, we take the values of all the reasonable agents and we aggregate them in some way. And I'm thinking that this is a really, really bad way of aggregating people's values. It's bad for a couple of reasons. And I'll give you an example in a second, but the two main abstract reasons is that it doesn't take into account how much something is against someone's values. Like, I'm against stealing, and I'm against killing millions of people, but if I had to pick one, then there would be a definite choice. And so that's the first problem. And I forgot what the second problem is. Let's just go straight to the example. So we've got this case where we've got these two people. And there's three actions: running, skipping, and jumping. Maybe you can, I'm thinking that these are actions that like people would do in general. It's not like Anne or Beth is against themselves running, skipping, or jumping. It's more like they have moral indignance about people committing these actions. And here's how they rank them. Anne thinks running is okay. She thinks skipping is reprehensible. But she thinks jumping is like the worst thing ever. And Beth is similar, but she thinks jumping is actually fine. And by thinks, I don't mean she believes, I mean, I'm reporting their value system. Maybe they don't really have any relevant beliefs about this kind of stuff. She agrees that skipping is reprehensible, but she thinks running is the worst thing ever. Now I'm telling you that these are the two reasonable people, or these are the two reasonable sets of values you could have in this very, very simplified case. So what's wrong with this case? Well, let's go back to this thing hash. An act is wrong if and only if for every reasonable value system B, A is contrary to B. Well, running is not contrary to Anne's values, so running is okay. Jumping is not contrary to Beth's values, so jumping is okay. Skipping is contrary to both of their values, so skipping is not allowed, morally speaking. So in this case, contractualism says that the one thing that's wrong is skipping. And I'm thinking that this is a really bad way of aggregating their values for the following reason. If you ask them to get together and come up with some rules for the regulation of society, they certainly would not agree to skip. So, wait, they certainly would not agree to have the only rule be don't skip. Anne would really want the rule don't jump. Beth would really want the rule don't run. And so that they might much prefer that people do this reprehensible thing instead of permitting both of these things. Right, which is what contractualism would say is the right way of aggregating their values into the sort of the true theory of morality. And I'm thinking, well, if the two reasonable people would absolutely hate the rules that contractualism recommends, then that seems, A, it seems wrong, and B, it seems contrary to the spirit of contractualism, which is all about this idea of sort of getting a consensus among reasonable people. So that's why I'm thinking that this is not the right way to do it. For what it's worth, I don't think you should try to do morality by aggregating what reasonable people think. But I'm thinking once you're sort of doing that, you should read the social choice literature and come up with, know about Arrow's theorem and various other things of that nature, instead of just going straight for the first aggregative procedure that you think of. So that's why bulletic contractualism doesn't seem like a very good idea. Now, to get this problem, we had to assume that Anne and Beth are the two reasonable people, or they have the two reasonable value sets. You might think initially that, well, reasonable people, given that they're reasonable, shouldn't disagree on too much. And so it would be kind of weird for Anne to think running is totally fine when she thinks jumping is the worst thing ever. So Anne thinks running is totally fine when this other reasonable person thinks that running is like the worst thing ever. That might initially be surprising, and so you might think, well, actually, Zach, this isn't a big problem for contractualism because reasonable people would have way more agreement in their values. So the worst case scenario thing would be more like skipping, like maybe Beth can switch skipping and running. But you can't, there can't be reasonable people who totally permute each other's orderings of how much they like things. And I'm thinking that it's kind of hard to, maybe this structure exactly is not possible, but I'm thinking that in general, there's going to be people who are very, very similar in their values on a superficial level of description, but nevertheless disagree a lot about how bad things are. I'll give you two examples, or one example depending on whether you get convinced by this one. So I'm thinking that just suppose that it's reasonable to be a utilitarian, and also that there's a certain kind of bug or microbe or something, or small mammal, whatever it is that you think is sort of down at the bottom of the hierarchy of how important things are. And it's kind of hard to tell. Just think of your favorite case where it's hard to tell whether the lives of these things count at all. I'm just going to call them bugs. Anne thinks that bugs count for a really, really tiny but positive amount. Beth thinks that they count for absolutely nothing, which is to say, on Anne's value system, killing zillions of bugs is really bad, whereas on Beth's value system, killing zillions of bugs is just the same as like smashing zillions of stones. It's just morally irrelevant. Now, then you put them in a situation where they have to choose between either killing one person or killing just a ridiculously huge number of bugs in whatever way that Anne thinks is the slightest bit bad for one bug. We're just going to multiply the number of bugs. Since they're both utilitarians, Anne is going to think that killing 10 to the power 100 bugs, or whatever it is just the worst thing ever, and is so much worse than killing one person, or 10 people I had in this example. Whereas Beth is going to think killing 10 people is totally unmitigated by the fact that the other option was to kill 10 to the power 100 bugs. It's like, if you can press a button that smashes 10 to the power 100 stones to save 10 people, then of course you should do that. So, and it seems like despite having a superficially being almost totally in agreement, namely they're both utilitarians and they both think bugs count for almost nothing, we find that in this situation they have a pretty massive disagreement about what's the right thing to do. Like, they don't think this is just a small deal. They think that it's the difference between they agree that the difference between the two options is at least the importance of killing 10 people. So they would understandably feel pretty upset that the other one doesn't want to go along with what they say is okay. So that's the way of getting a sort of structure where there's some apparently reasonable people where it's hard to say that one of them's not reasonable, and also they have this kind of structure in that they one thinks that something is totally fine, that the other one thinks is just the worst. Okay, so that's the sort of response to the response on bulletic contractualism. And I've put the secondary argument in footnote 2, which is split between pages 3 and 4. So, okay, so that's why I don't like bulletic contractualism. And now we move on to doxastic contractualism. Kyle, how long have I been talking?
Half an hour, so you got about half an hour.
Okay, good. And this is where there's another sort of level of logical complexity. So I'm just going to say some stuff that I probably can't reconstruct immediately, but hopefully you can either trust me or confirm it yourself. So doxastic contractualism says we're sort of interpreting rejection as believing that a principle is incorrect. And for a principle to be incorrect is at the top of this page 3, which is it's correct if it forbids only wrong actions. It's incorrect if it forbids an action that's actually fine. And by actually fine, I mean not wrong. Now, we're thinking to reject a principle is just to believe that it is incorrect. Or maybe to know or to be sure of or something like that. I'm just using the word believes for whatever doxastic state you think is going to be relevant here. Now, this view is a bit more complicated, so I want to simplify things a little bit by coming up with a model. And in particular, we're going to just be looking at the permissibility or not of a certain very special class of actions that are the ones described in case 4. And in particular, they're called these alpha n. Alpha n is an action which basically looks like this. There's a certain kind of medicine that you're about to suffer from a really nasty headache for an hour. And you can take this medicine, and it'll prevent the headache, and that's pretty good. On the other hand, there's someone else who's about to suffer from a headache that's equally nasty, but it's going to last for n seconds. And what you could do is give the medicine to them instead. Right, so if n is only 5 seconds, then like it's clearly fine to commit this action alpha n, because you're relieving an hour of your pain, and the only cost is that they get 5 seconds of pretty severe pain. The interesting number of seconds are the ones where n is a little bit more than 3600. I think Scanlon is definitely thinking that it's okay to be a little bit selfish. So, you know, if n is like 3, 6, 13 or something, this is like an hour and 13 seconds. So I think he's definitely thinking that it's not wrong to take the pill when it would relieve 13 additional seconds of pain in the other person. I mean, I'm kind of a utilitarian, so I disagree with that, but I feel like from my perspective, you can get cases with this structure as well. And I think the thing that's going to be important about these sorts of actions is that some of them are definitely wrong. If n is 1 billion, I think, then it's definitely wrong to take that medicine when it would prevent 1 billion seconds, which is about 30 years of severe pain in the other person. So we're thinking that there's this critical number, it's more than 3600, and it's less than 1 billion. And it's sort of the cutoff between going from, it's fine to take the medicine yourself, and then all of a sudden it's wrong. And the thing I want you to appreciate is that we seem to have absolutely no way of figuring out what exactly that number is. Right? We agree with that. Like, you definitely won't be able to say if it's 4,873 or something, right? Yeah. I mean, I think I can say what the number is, by the way. I think it's exactly 3,600. But if you're thinking that it's okay to be a little bit selfish, then it's basically impossible to say exactly what the number is. Okay, so once we've got this set up, we do a formal epistemology thing, and well, I've got the terminology in the handout. Now, what bits of it are important? Maybe I'll let you read the setup of the case, and then we find two possible views. There's opaque doxastic contractualism, and there's transparent doxastic contractualism. These sorts of what you get when you take the definitions that are put here, and you just replace the words in the statement of negative existential contractualism with the definitions. And I've used like random variable notation, so I feel like it's probably a little bit obscure. But
can I ask one?
Yeah.
Sorry, just in the doxastic states, when you say dp, you really do mean that p is a subset of d, or do you mean d is a subset of p? I'm used to reading believe that p as the subject doxastic state entails p. In other words, dox is a subset.
I think that should be right. Yeah, I hope nothing depends on that, but if that's the standard thing, then that's definitely the thing I wanted to do.
That's what
I was trying to do a standard thing. Yes.
Okay, just what I thought.
I think you just have a set of believed propositions, but you could just take the intersection to get the thing I was talking about. Right?
No, but each of these is the doxastic state. That's supposed to, each one is supposed to be representing a believer, and then I think this is the stochastic entry for belief. Basically.
Yeah, it's supposed to be that kind of thing. So I'm definitely trying to assume that belief is like closed under conjunction and entailment and that kind of stuff. So, and just be wary that the calligraphic D is the set of doxastic states, whereas the italic Ds are the doxastic states, which are just lots of sets of possible worlds. And as Carl says, you believe every proposition, which is a superset of that worlds. Okay, so anyway, we plug this all into the definition of contractualism, where we think of this guy as a random variable, because I'm thinking people aren't going to in general be sure about the value of the critical cutoff. So we can think of it as taking a value in each possible world, some numerical value. And we can think of also a principle as a random variable. A principle just is sort of like a property of actions, and I'm just assuming that nobody has any credence in the idea that this one can be wrong, but a bigger number can be not wrong. Right, everyone knows that it's better to decrease the amount of pain. So if this one's wrong, everyone knows things like this one's wrong, then that one's wrong. So basically, simplifying matters a little bit. A principle can also be thought of as a number-valued random variable. It takes a specific number in each state, and what it forbids is the number's bigger than that in that world. Right? So if it takes the number the principle that gives you 12 in a given world is the principle that says you can't commit alpha 12 or higher. And that's what it says in that world. So that's what it forbids in that world. Okay, so then we plug in all these definitions to contractualism, and we get opaque doxastic contractualism. And I'm thinking that opaque doxastic contractualism totally sucks, because it implies that, and I call it opaque because we're permitting principles where you don't know what it forbids. Principles where it takes a different value in different worlds. And since you might not know which world you're in, it'll be opaque what it forbids. Right? Because what it forbids in a world depends on the number it gives you in the world. So the reason why opaque doxastic contractualism sucks is that we can take this principle, or at least this random variable, x, which is, this is equation 7 on page 3, and it gives you so at worlds which are not your favorite world, I suppose it's the actual world, it gives you one more than the actual cutoff in that world. Which is to say, it forbids, it's stricter than the actual cutoff because it forbids, is it stricter or is it more permissive? So the actual cutoff in this world is alpha of CW, everything, for every bigger number, and this one, this is wrong. Yeah, exactly. So if we take a bigger number, then we permit you to commit this action, and everything bigger than. So we permit you to take this action, but not one more than that. Okay. So this guy is more permissive, which is to say it's less likely to be incorrect. It's not so, in fact, it's only incorrect in world 0. Right? Because in every other world it is correct because it doesn't forbid anything that is in fact wrong. So since it's, but in fact what it forbids in world 0 is this thing, right? And in world 0, what's wrong is actually, like the cutoff for wrongness is world 0, C of world 0 rather than 1 minus it. So at world 0, what this principle in fact forbids is something false, and in every other world it's not incorrect. So since it in fact forbids something that is not wrong, that means that there has to be some reasonable agent who rejects it. But it's correct in every world besides world 0. So that means that in world 0, there has to be some reasonable agent who is 100% sure that world 0 is the actual world. Right? So we find that in every world, there has to be a reasonable doxastic state which is sure of that world. And I think that's quite absurd because that doesn't accord very well with your ordinary notion of reasonableness, where you think, well, you know, like I'm required by reasonableness not to be extremely confident of things like how many electrons there are. And so this is what I don't like about transparent doxastic contractualism. I mean, you might think that there's necessarily a God who can choose in each world, and then you'd say that what's wrong is actually just, you don't have to look at all the reasonable people, you just have to look at God. And then you can now define wrongness as, what's wrong is what's believed by God to be wrong. And so contractualism collapses into a sort of divine command theory thing, but I don't think that that's what they want to do. And also, I think that it's quite implausible that there could be something, who knows. It's quite implausible that there is, in fact, anybody who knows that this world is actual. Well, I find that implausible. Maybe you guys don't. But if you think that possibly there's a world where nobody knows that world is actual, then you'd have to say that possibly contractualism is wrong. Okay. So, well, possibly opaque doxastic contractualism. So anyway, so much for opaque doxastic contractualism. I think the problem with it is that we've permitted as principles these opaque ones that take a different value in all the different worlds. I think a much more natural way of catching out what a principle is, or what the significant principles are the ones where every agent in question knows what they forbid and what they don't forbid. So you could model these as constant random variables that take the same value in each world, or you can just think of them as just numbers. Namely, the principle n is the principle which forbids alpha n plus 1, and so on. So we have transparent doxastic contractualism sort of is contractualism personified in that way. And I'm pretty sure we can simplify this a fair bit in this thing that I've called star, which again eliminates the notion of principle and just says an act is wrong. So I'll try to write this in English. Wrong equals, okay, this is already not English, but for every reasonable doxastic state, let's do it like this. Alpha n is wrong. I guess I would put n in the handout. So you don't, for every reasonable doxastic state D, that state does not believe that alpha m is not wrong. And the rationale for that is, if we look in star, m being less than c means m is not wrong, because that just means m is less than the cutoff for wrongness. Okay, so this is the sort of the simplification of contractualism we get once we cash it out in this way. And the first thing I already said is that there's no such thing as a principle anymore. It's just a sort of like, to figure out what's wrong, you just sort of look at all the reasonable people's opinions about what's wrong and then sort of put them together in the right way. And there's this interesting thing that happens is that if this is what wrongness is, then you'd think reasonable people could come to know this sort of identity, and that's sort of built into the model. And so their opinions about what is and is not wrong would have to reflect their opinions about what reasonable people think. And so there's this weird higher order knowledge or higher order belief thing going on. Now, yeah, so there's two weird things that go on here. The first is observation 10, where we say, suppose the cutoff is 5,000. I think that's a sort of pretty reasonable guess. And that means that there has to be some reasonable doxastic state. So C equals 5,000 implies that some reasonable person, state has it that alpha 4999 is not wrong. And the proof of this is basically just unpacking the definition. But the upshot of it is that in this situation where the cutoff really is 5,000, there's some reasonable state you can be in where you really believe that alpha 4999 is not wrong, which is kind of surprising given that alpha 5,000 is wrong. So you have to have this sort of really, what seems like a really sort of risky belief. It seems like you should leave a margin for error, basically. And contractualism says some reasonable person has to push right up against the true value of the cutoff. And I just say, well, that doesn't seem very reasonable to me. It seems like reasonableness should require leaving the sort of margin for error that we know that all actual agents have when it comes to their powers of moral discernment. That's the first funny thing that happens when you have transparent doxastic contractual. And it's not like a complete disaster, but it seems kind of bad. And the second thing, also not a complete disaster, but a bit funny, is that suppose I have a doxastic state D and you have your doxastic state D prime, and we know what our respective doxastic states are. And one of us is we don't agree on where the cutoff is, which is to say, where we stop being sure about the cutoff being greater than some number is we differ on that. So if I'm sure that 4,800 is wrong, and you're not sure, then I cannot be sure that you're reasonable. So let me actually write this down. D 4800 is greater than or equal to the cutoff, and not D prime that. And the thought is that if we have this situation, then doxastic state D cannot include the proposition that D prime is a reasonable doxastic state. The reason why is that if you knew that this one was reasonable, then I'm pretty sure you'd be able to plug this into contractualism. Like you'd have that D prime is reasonable, and you'd have a example from which you could then infer that in fact the cutoff is. I feel like I've made a mistake with the quantifiers here, but I feel like the gist of it is that if you know some other thing is reasonable, then that gives you a lot of information about what's in fact good or bad. So that's what's in fact wrong, because if you know this identity, then you can infer a lot of stuff from that. So I better just double check what it says. Yeah, so I think the relevant thing is rather. So if you believe that 4800 is not wrong, and I believe, and and I don't believe 4800 is not wrong, then maybe you're just going to have to see if my proof on following observation 11 is actually a valid one. Anyway, so the gist is just that there's some weird interaction effects between thinking that other people are reasonable and inferring something about what's in fact wrong and not wrong. And I mean, I don't think that's the biggest disaster in the world, but it is kind of weird because for the contractualist, it's typically thought that like you sort of can tell when something's reasonable or not. Because if you can't really tell, then you're in equally big trouble when you try to apply contractualism to a given case. And if there's like this fundamental barrier to believing that people who are less permissive than you are reasonable, then you can't, I don't know, that's sort of against the spirit of contractualism. I think in general, I don't think there's something surprising about reasonable people not knowing who's reasonable, but I was thinking there's, for the contractualist in particular, it's a bit more. Anyway, so that's sort of where I got to. Seems like the best way of cashing out contractualism in my super not faithful to Scanlon way, like my reconstruction of what Scanlon might have been thinking if he spoken my language, seems to be transparent doxastic contractualism. And even transparent doxastic contractualism has some apparently pretty severe problems requiring reasonable agents to have what seem like really, really risky beliefs, and also requiring them to have some weird beliefs about what sort of doxastic states are reasonable. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for listening.
Great, we'll take 5 minutes. We'll meet back at